Hello, this is Matt Janucki, and you're listening to Inside Men's Mental Health, brought to you by Psych Sessions. Here we explore this thing called masculinity and its impact on men's mental health, relationships, and communities. We'll learn together through conversations with thought leaders, innovators, and industry experts. Our conversations will also help us understand how these experts became interested in men's mental health and the ways their journeys have made them who they are today. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Aaron Rochlen from the University of Texas at Austin. It was a real pleasure to chat with Aaron, whose work has really impacted my own. We discussed how a specific paper he read in graduate school began a journey of interest in working with men in therapy, Aaron's groundbreaking work on men's depression, and even his work on stay-at-home fathers that caught the attention of NBC's The Today Show. For any movie buffs, we found some time to discuss movies that relate to men's mental health. Enjoy. Dr. Aaron Rochlen, welcome today. Just want to do a quick introduction. Clinical professor of counseling psychology area chair in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. Aaron, you're past president of APA Division 51, the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. You're also co-editor with Fred Rabinowitz, Breaking Barriers and Counseling with Men, and an author of just a number of scholarly articles. So just an accomplished person. And so just glad to have the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on and that overly kind introduction.
Absolutely. Well, you're welcome. Since really the overarching goal is to talk about men's health and masculinities, really just interested in just a bit too about your journey, like how you came to this topic, how you became passionate about it. Just maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I like to think that some of it happened on purpose, but I'm sure most of it was just kind of a serendipitous path, which I do believe happens a lot in our life and in research. I think I started to get interested more in just kind of what it meant to be a young man when I was a young man trying to figure out myself. A lot of peer pressures growing up, lots of messages around, what being a tough guy was or what being an overly expressive or kind of vulnerable guy was. It didn't make sense to me as I was going through it, but then ended up going University of Michigan, where I went to undergrad and recognized that people really do study this stuff and took some great gender studies courses, learned a little bit about feminist theory. And then when I went to grad school at University of Maryland and found out about some of the work that was really just starting to be done and some of the people who were doing it, go down the list, but Fred Rabinowitz was very influential, Mark Stevens, Jim O'Neill, Mahalik, as well as my own advisor at the time, Karen O'Brien, and recognizing that it was just pretty good timing,
Sure.
actually, to start getting into some of that research. But I like to use the word me search. It's very much true for me. It helped me figure out a lot of the good, the bad, and the neutral about being a guy. Something I've always loved, but it hasn't always come easy, so to speak. And yeah, and also some of it was around just help seeking. And I remember even as a high school student, like how hard it was to talk to my parents about thinking that maybe I needed to see a therapist.
Yeah.
Um, and why that felt difficult, and then learning more about the science behind that and the basic fact that most men, do have not as positive attitudes about it and seek help out less often. And even in couples counseling, it's often usually initiated by the female partner in heterosexual relationships, and left wondering why that is. So that's those kind of basic but important questions led me to dive deeper into the field and then learn more about how I can be helpful to the greatest number of men professionally, but also just friends of mine in my life.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Yeah, of course I have a whole bunch of questions, right? Just to ask about that. But one is as you're talking about your experience of growing up and the you experienced being a male in the world, and then later on, I think some of what I heard you say is that as you went into this academic environment. You were at Michigan. There was kind of some language that was put around this to kind of help you understand it. But I wonder if, like, in your family, was that like masculinity and what masculinity is like, and being a man, was that something that was bounced around or discussed much?
Good question. Yes and no. I would say
Yeah.
the language was not bounced around, but the messages were.
Okay.
And it's not like I was raised in a super traditional or hyper masculine
Yeah.
environment, but it was more just like everybody else,
Yeah.
of which that had some of it. Um, so I think that I don't look upon those messages in really negative ways then, but I see them different now. I think probably more so in terms of how guys interacted with each other than like parental or societal messages for me. But
Yeah.
I think in the general, communities, especially back in kind of like the 80s and 90s, that yeah, it was all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
70s, 80s, 90s. It was, parental messages, societal messages, and friendship relationships as well as dating relationships. So it just became much more of the language and kind of a more normative context to talk about it. What I don't know, what's an interesting question, is I really don't know if it's a reflection of there being more academic theory and research or just kind of happened or
Yeah.
gender, norms loosened up and became flexible. I mean, you've already mentioned, which is interesting, I'll put it back on you, like
Yeah.
you used the word masculinities,
Yeah.
plural. And when I'm looking back into the field and some of the research I've been a part of and some I've just been familiar of, that change was like enormous.
Sure.
It was not just linguistic or academic. It was actually really important because I think others believe like when you say psychology of men and masculinity, which is when I was president, that's what it was called, the division, the journal, etc. That implies that there is one way, good, bad, or other,
Sure.
of being masculine. And now when you say masculinities, it might be a little awkward to say, but it implies no, there's actually multiple ways. So the field has become more complex, but I think more accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's certainly interesting to reflect on that and on your experience really on the ground. Yeah, seeing that change,
Yeah,
and how important that change has been.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, another thing that I was thinking about was just I think just an identification with some of your experience of going into just being a guy growing up in rural Texas, and just that was the water that I was swimming in, and seeing the guys that I was in school with and cared about with, and just kind of noticing it and experiencing it, but then going into my undergraduate experience where Gary Brooks, I think you
Yeah,
know
of
Gary
course.
Brooks
Yeah,
is. He was one of my professors there, and hearing him just talk about, what this is. The guys have a gender. This is what it can look like and how it can impact them. Like, whoa, this looks like, a lot of the guys that are in my family, guys that I know. And so it was kind of this experience of it just really kind of put some things in kind of in a frame for me, and gave me some understanding, kind of just enlightened me. And that was just a really important moment. And I knew that, like, I cared about these guys and I wanted to make a difference. And so and kind of understand, I think that transition point was important for me.
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So then when did you at some point in time say, like, I want to make this my career, right? This is my career to try and make an impact on this field. Tell me about that a little bit.
Huh. Well, for a while, I think it was just like that's what I was doing. You hear the story a lot, and it was similar to mine, is like that's where I felt comfortable in those classes, and
Yeah.
that's where I did well in those classes, and
Yeah.
how I was surrounded by people I generally liked. And that led me to want to stay in it more than like I knew what I was going to be doing. And similarly for me, like I really liked being on a big campus and sports. like the whole thing. Like I just loved the university environment, and I just kind of realized, oh, whoa, like these professors are that's what they get to do. They get to hang around and give back. So it was kind of a basic understanding of like I liked that work. But I did work in different areas in as an undergraduate. So in terms of research in psychology, I still remember what I was doing, which was pretty fun. Um, but it was really just what I thought I did well. And then when I went to grad school, it also changed because I really didn't it almost didn't click, which I think is true for some people still, that I knew what I was doing by entering a doctoral program, and I thought I did want to be a professor for those reasons I mentioned, but it didn't hit me so much that like, whoa, I'm actually entering a degree that allows me to be a psychologist and is giving me training to do so. And that is a big deal and a big responsibility. I think
Sure.
it's also a privilege, but it's also a big responsibility. And when students come into a program or applicants and they're in the interview, I often ask them that question, and it surprises them a little bit because it's a little like outside the box, because
Sure.
some I think aren't really expecting that question, or aren't ready to think of themselves as psychologists. But and I definitely wasn't. So it was in grad school when I started to get experience, and I don't think I was very good at the beginning, but that's kind of often how you start, where that became intriguing to me, and I wanted to get better, and I was very interested in the culture of of therapy and how it was a contradiction with um most way men express themselves, or the culture around
Yeah.
masculinity. In fact, I still remember, I think it was Glenn Good, who's dean at the University of Florida. He talked about the double bind men
Yeah.
thing.
Right.
And yeah, and it was one article, and it's just like, wow, that I love that concept of men in the double bind. It's like they're kind of there's the lack of fit between, like I said, the culture around masculinity and the culture of therapy. And so we're kind of screwed there. As a generalization, I'm not saying everybody, but for a lot of guys. And I was like, wow. So do you change the guy or do you change the therapy,
Mm, hmm.
the modality? And that's when that basic question that really hasn't been resolved, although I think there's been some mini progress, was pretty like, oh, whoa, like I like that. That's actually a real world question. It's kind of catchy.
Sure.
It's kind of like intriguing to me.
So this
So
is
that's
going on.
when I realized I could get into this from a research and a clinical perspective.
You're reading this and getting excited about this. You're a graduate student at this point, and
Yeah.
this is clicking with you. Yeah.
And there wasn't, I'll be honest, it was not everything was clicking. But that point was like, whoa, whoa. There was another article by Robertson and Fitzgerald,
Okay.
1992. I think it was called Overcoming the Masculine Mystique.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that article because I remember reading a lot of articles. I'm like, I can barely read that. I don't understand that. I don't like it. I don't whatever. But all it takes was a couple. And that one was like so well written. Uh, I mean, I still remember the name of that article. And sometimes I look at it again and realize, okay, why did I like that article so much? So stuff like that. Robertson Fitzgerald, 1992.
Okay. Yeah, I think of that when I still have my undergrads read um, O'Neill's 1981, like gender role conflict, masculine mystique, and value system, because it's an article that really caught me as a graduate student. But I think there's also a lot of approachable things as
Yeah.
well that I think that students can grasp. And so, you have a similar like attachment to that paper too.
So weird. I just looked it up, and yeah, it was overcoming the masculine mystique, preferences for alternative forms of assistance among men who avoid conflict. And really, the methodology of it is like, it's not terrific, especially these days, but the premise behind it and the writing is fantastic.
Yeah. When I think about you, I mean, and of course you had work going on before this. When I think about your work that I became familiar with as a graduate student was the work that you were doing on depression in men.
Yeah, yeah,
And so just wanted to talk with you a little bit about that and maybe just first open the door for people a little bit around what some of that looks like what some
yeah,
of the research has helped us understand about some men that experience depression in this
yeah,
way, and
yeah.
maybe you could just frame that for us a bit.
Sure. Again, kind of looking back at it, my interest in it came from a very like simple but important data points that were just like slapping me in the face in a good way. And that's the data point that women are depressed. Maybe I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but overall, something like 4 to 5, 3 to 5 times as often as men. Yet men commit suicide, which is fair to say is the most feared outcome of serious
Sure.
depression, um, 3 to 4 times more often than women. They use more lethal ways. They don't mess around. They're effective at it. So that kind of made me wonder. And I also always thought that like that just doesn't quite make sense. I don't believe that women are depressed more often than men. I think we're all equally often
Yeah.
depressed.
Yeah.
That's my belief. It's maybe not so. And then I started learning more about diagnosis and stuff and still continue to learn more about it. But then you can look at the depression criteria and start to have questions about Mm. This is what we're clinically calling a diagnosis of depression, but I believe, and others have written this much more eloquently than I am, and Michael Addis is one of them whose work I was
Sure.
very influenced by, talking about atypical and what's the word, externalizing their depression instead of internalizing it, and a lot of those ways of um putting their depression out there is just not captured by traditional ways of depression. And then not to mention men go to the doctor and go to the psychologist less often than women, so maybe that's why they're not getting diagnosed. So yeah, so I became like that's probably maybe something's going on with that.
Yeah.
And then and still it's a tough thing to measure, but there is now pretty good research to show that, it's called different things. It's called atypical depression. It's called more externalized depression. It's been called male type depression. Of course, or there's a problem with calling it male type depression because there's plenty of women
Yeah.
who may express their gender identity in ways that are more typical of men or in a more traditionally masculine way, that they have that, but may identify biologically as being women. So it's
Sure.
freaking complicated,
It's
but in a
messy.
good
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
In a good way, because I
Yeah.
think now we have terminology at least to identify with it. But as a generalization, I believe that there are a lot of guys, and I've been there myself, who really are depressed or can have depressive bouts, low, medium, or high, but aren't going to meet that classic um, criteria or way of measuring depression. But they could benefit from treatment, psychological, medicinal, you know, supportive, etc. So that really intrigued me. And a really, I don't know if you know this, but this is was a really very powerful thing. It was actually, looking back in my career, one of the most highlights, a, a result of something very sad. But when Robin Williams committed suicide,
Yeah.
I wrote and I loved Robin Williams. And I wrote an op-ed um called something like Uncovering Mass Depression, Robin Williams, something like that. And and it was all about that, and it started off with something kind of catchy. Actually, it came from a friend of mine that I stole, although I gave him credit for it. It said something like beware of the person who laughs the loudest might be the most depressed.
Yeah.
And I kind of started it with that and then told the Robin Williams, my at the time perception of, of what may have happened. Anyway, it was a pretty good article. And a couple weeks later, I got a handwritten note from the president of the University of Texas. President Powers was his name. He's since passed away. And it was something like, "Dear Professor Rochlen, I read your article on Robin Williams, and just I thought it was very, important article. And I don't know if he said I relate to it because I don't want to put that out there if he didn't say that, but something that was clear that it was he found it powerful
Yeah.
and important and took the time to handwrite, which people
Right.
don't do much. Even back then, they don't do much. Now they do even less. And I was like, wow, that was pretty awesome. And to me, something like that is still like a lot more of a wow than like getting something published in a
Sure. And an
article.
opportunity to reach
Yeah, that
likely so many more
from someone I
folks.
really impress and
Yeah.
was, there's been a couple moments in my life where I've gotten like responses from people, some people famous, some people not famous, where my stuff and my work or has impacted them, and those moments really stand out. So write people letters, folks.
They read it. It's meaningful to them.
Yeah, especially handwritten these days. They're
Yeah.
like, what is that?
Let me ask you a question around that uh, guys in depression and trying to, you're talking about kind of the language with it. Like, what's the right term? That is it mass depression? Is it male depression? Is it externalizing depression, masculine depression? And then part of that's this language that captures it. Part of this, I think, too, is a way that can be relatable for people that captures an
Yeah, yeah,
experience that resonates with them.
yeah.
And I'm thinking of, for example, some of the work that I think you were involved with, like thinking of the Real Men, Real
Yeah, I
Depression
did a lot with that.
campaign.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
did
And
a
so
lot.
that's some, I'm wondering what your thoughts, like my guess is with something like that, the idea is to try and frame men experiencing depression in a way that can resonate with these guys and kind of the thought and challenge around that.
Great question. Well, first of all, I'll almost go back to the first thing, and then I do want to talk about the Real Men, Real Depression.
Yeah.
I kind of, there are a lot of words thrown out there for what we're talking about, and I kind of like mass depression. I think it's just a word that people relate to. First of all, I think they understand like the mask is the covering up of something. I also, I think when you wear a mask, it's like, well, what's behind the mask? I think people relate to that. I think that when people are depressed, there's a lot of people that look and sound
Yeah.
and seem like they're not depressed, that they have a mask, that they got things together. I think mask is an interesting word because masculinity starts with mask.
Yeah.
There's like all kinds of so I like that one. I think and it's also not unique to just men. It can be anyone who might relate to a covering up of their depression for whatever reason. They don't want to admit it. They don't have the words. They don't have the terminology to express it. Um there's a lot of powerful examples of people whose lives look amazing, and probably at some level are amazing. And so they feel a lot of guilt
Yeah.
about depression because they look at their lives and they're like, oh my God, so many people have a worse situation than me. So that's a negative depression, and they get depressed about their depression. Just like people who, get anxious about their anxiety,
Yeah.
people get depressed about their depression. That is real. But anyway, so I like depression, and now, or I like mass
Mass
depression.
depression. Yeah. Yeah.
But back to the Real Men, Real Depression. That was a really interesting little thing. First of all, it was pretty cool because I actually was collaborating with several people in the marketing department, including the chair of the Department of Marketing at UT, a guy named Wayne Hoyer, who helped me kind of understand the consumerism behind it. And
Yeah.
then at the time, NIH had this like Real Men, Real Depression campaign, and it was exactly what you think it would be. They had these like really like kind of tough guys, firemen, police officers, muscular athletes, talking about their depression as a way of getting those types of folks to identify and realize it's not weak to be depressed or reach out for help. Um, and oh yeah, and their tagline was, "It takes courage to ask for help. These men did. Real men, real depression." At some level, it's kind of like lovely. Like, okay, it works, like, well, I don't know if it worked. I mean, we did show that people generally connected with some components of those brochures and those ads.
Yeah.
They're pretty well done. It was not even more so now, but it was not without its controversy. Because when you say real men,
Right.
it implies what? It implies
There's somebody who's not real men, right?
yes, good,
Yeah.
good. See, I put you on the spot there and you
Yeah.
got a plus. So yeah, when you say real men, it implies, yeah, I know, right? I would have got it wrong, I'm sure. But yeah, so just to restate what you said, when you say real men, it implies that there is a such thing as a not real man.
Yeah.
And the ad is even goes a little further and says not only is there not a real man, but the way you probably think about it is that um, you know, is that a depressed person is not real and a depressed man is not real and maybe feminine, like a fear of femininity
Yeah.
is a theme around a lot of the, masculine theories and concepts and norms, like, so that's kind of a problem. Now, my own 2 cents is, especially when that came out, I'm kind of like, well, here's the deal. That is kind of a little bit of a problematic message for sure. But here's the real world about advertising and marketing and campaigns is it's not targeted towards everybody.
Yeah.
So of course it might be unfair and even hurtful. I hope not hurtful, but it could have been. But it's not targeted towards everybody. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. You have to go for um, audiences in different creative ways. We see advertisements even in the Super Bowl, and you're like, what? What is that? It's so ridiculous. But somebody is spending, I don't know how much, $20 million on that for a reason.
Right.
So, just not the target audience. I might not be for some ad that it makes no sense. So, targeted and tailored messages around depression. In fact, that leads me to after that campaign, I was doing some grant work with some physicians, and that's what it was: targeted and tailored messages around men and depression. And we did some focus groups, and number of studies came out of that.
So the something that looks in the kind of the next step. So you're doing this grant work with these physicians that looked a little more, in your opinion, targeted and tailored. And I'm wondering what that might look like as well.
Well, my memory's a little fuzzy on some of
Yeah.
those studies, so I'd have to go back and look at it. That was kind of the name of the grant, and I can
Yeah.
send you some of the focus groups were really actually pretty good, and that was one of the sub studies that I led. Um, but I'd have to kind of go back and look at what stood out for that to go more into. But what I liked about the timing of that is I was doing, and then my work kind of shifted to fathering a little bit and non-traditional stuff. But what I liked about that is like that real men, real depression work did get the attention of several more like medically oriented, you know, heavy NIH funding physicians, and
Yeah.
I was able to collaborate. I was like a consultant, I don't know, or co-investigator or something. But yeah, that was also a good sign that this work is starting to get more into um, medical settings and scenarios.
I want to talk about your fathering work a little bit. I have a final question, then I'll leave you be on men and depression. But I'm thinking back to a talk that I saw you give on mass depression in men, and to demonstrate some points in your talk, you used some video of Tony Soprano to
Yeah.
try and help us understand like this kind of what this can look like. And I'm wondering if like for people who might be interested, do you have any ideas? Are there some media examples or kind of movie examples, Tony Soprano or others, that you think kind of give us a picture of what this like externalized depression looks like if people are wondering?
Yeah, sure. It's a timely question because I've been last 2 or 3 years I've taught a class at UT. It's a signature class for incoming students to the university, and it's been on movies and mental health. And it's been really very well received in terms of
Yeah,
kind of
I bet.
popular class. Students absolutely love it. It's been fun to teach. It's been a little hard to like refresh it every semester because I get a little comfortable with my movies. So I'm trying
Yeah.
to diversify them some. I could definitely do that class on, probably just men in depression or men in mental health and their portrayal. Um, but I mean, Tony Soprano was a good one. It's feeling a little dated these days, of
Yeah.
course. But a really good one that wrestles, no pun intended, around a lot of themes of masculinity is The Wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
Probably about 10 years old, but that
Yeah, I
was
was just talking about that movie the other day. Yeah.
absolutely unbelievable. And I did have when that came out and I was just blown away by it. I did have like I invited over some some of my prof friends and we all
Yeah.
watched it and discussed it. So that one was very good. Let me think. Like A Beautiful Mind is very good for mental health um in general, but not really depression. There's a lot on like substance abuse and its overlap. But actually, no, I got a good one. No, I got a good one, and this one I do use in my movies and mental health when I cover depression, and I do it intentionally. It's just coming to mind now. I'm glad because I hadn't thought about it. Um, because when we cover depression, which is a very important topic, obviously that I want to talk about in that class, but I'm like, whoa, like this is a lot of deeply depressing
Yeah. It's
movies.
heavy.
Really heavy topic
Yeah.
at Mondays at 9 a.m. for 18-year-old students at the University of Texas. So that was the one I really wanted to be thoughtful of how I did it without just leaving everyone in a like terrible state. So I did that. And now your question makes you think, and it does show men in depression in externalized ways, and yet is a funny movie. And it's called Little Miss Sunshine. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't seen that. I've heard students talk about it, but I
Oh
have
my
not seen it.
God, that
I got to
is
put it
a
on my list now.
must, like must, total classic. And it won some awards. Steve Carell was one in the movie. Just it was amazing. You got to watch that. But there are, yeah, almost everyone in that film, which is kind of about a young girl named Olive who one is very into beauty pageants, and so they all take her to the Little Miss Sunshine beauty cat pageant, and have to all get in a shared van together, and she doesn't fit the typical, girl beauty pageants look or even personality. And then, yeah, it's just a story of kind of like how the family comes together over this, but about everyone except for that young girl is depressed in some ways,
Hmm.
but not in a traditional way. Lots of covering up,
Yeah.
lots of masking. Anyway, so that's a great one to use. So those are a couple that come to mind. A Beautiful Boy is also another great one about addiction,
Yeah.
but with a little bit of depression in it as well.
Steve Carell too, right? That
Yep.
one.
Also, we
Yeah.
got back to back Steve Carell's.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Just to give people maybe a like a frame of reference for like it seems like more and more folks have some understanding of this way guys might look, and they can look depressed different or cover up their depression. You were talking about that, but just I think more visuals is good. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Let me ask you about your fathering work in that I I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about it. And I think you were really on the forefront, you and your colleagues in the
Yeah.
forefront of really looking at like the experiences of like stay-at-home dads. And would just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about like that research and how that's impacted the field and impacted you, as a dad yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe you could
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about it.
Sure. Two more quick movies that came to mind.
Yeah.
The Whale. The Whale was very good, very intense. And American Beauty, which is
Yeah.
also unbelievable movie, can be thought of in that sense. So yeah, the my fatherhood stuff was also probably looking back, maybe the most proud of that work. And it was at a topic where it was at a time in my life where I became a father for the first time about 15, no, 17 years ago. Um, and so it all kind of came, to happen. And it wasn't just fathering that I was interested in. It was really um well, like you said, stay-at-home fathers and men and women in non-traditional family and career roles, including women as breadwinners and men either as sole, um, you know, taking care of the kids and the family or primary.
Yeah.
And in my family, we've had, some reverse gender roles probably in a lot of ways, but my wife is a physician, definitely the bigger breadwinner. And even when I was working hard, she was working a lot harder. And and also when our kids were born, like, it was a lot of work for both of us, but like
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
came a little easier. And she would admit this. She's better with the teenagers now, but she would admit like I was very hands-on and some of it was came more naturally to me. And I was just, and kind of enjoying most of that, but also like, oh wow, we are like this is outside of this kind of like the more gendered stereotypical
Yep.
role. So I knew a little bit about it, but not much. I was spending time at the park with my one kid and then two, and noticing that it was primarily women
Sure.
and
Yeah.
moms, but then there were a good bit of guys sneaking in there, especially in Austin. And then I was like, noticing the differences and noticing some of the vibe around that. There's also a good movie on this, by the way, called Little Children. It's a terrific movie.
Okay, great.
Kind of a creepy one, but a very good movie that integrates some of these dynamics. And I was like, whoa, like I don't know that much about this. And again, I'm noticing a theme in my own research. It was a very, very basic statistic that caught my attention and led me to think, wow, I can like do more research in this area, and it could be an area of public interest, which it
Yeah.
definitely was. I was on the Today Show.
Yeah.
Um, met Matt Lauer before Matt Lauer got in a lot of trouble speaking
Right.
about, men in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was a cool experience. And oh yeah, so back to the basic stat. I took a look at the census data, and census data is very imperfect, but it's can be very interesting. And when you dive in there it tells you like how many the income data shows like how many in heterosexual married couples, how many women out earn their male partners, either dual income or, income, no income.
Yeah.
And, in the ideal like gender equity scenario, you would, that number should be 50%. Well, we all know it's not 50%,
Yeah, absolutely.
but it's a lot higher than a lot of people think. And it's one of those like numbers. I haven't looked at it the last few years, but it's just like, whoa, it's like just slowly going up and up and up.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is happening. That is, I mean, it's maybe not surprising, but like that's going on. So rules are changing around who's making more money these days. And I think it was around 30% uh when I was doing that data. Maybe not quite that high, but I want to think so. So 30% of you know dual income. I think it was dual income. Women are out earning their male partners. That's
Okay.
a ton.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah. That's
50-50,
my
but
house. Yeah.
yeah, mine too, and a lot. And so it's just changing, and it changes so much around decision making and
Yeah.
finances and power. And again, I'm in favor of all of that, but it's not without a lot of challenges for men and for couples about what that means and the giving up of the financial, changes and what that means around childcare and cleaning and some tasks that have been more traditionally feminized for whatever reasons. And so just got more into that reason. The reason why guys become stay-at-home fathers, how they feel about it, how they're embracing the role or not. I also did a qualitative study on women who were married to stay-at-home fathers. That was also one of the more interesting studies I've done in a while because I thought it was going to be like a really good story. And it was not a particularly positive story because a lot of these women were not happy in
Mm.
their roles or with their partners. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those areas probably if I could do that over again, I would do a lot more research on that because I think that's really interesting.
What were some of the things the guys were saying? You talked about how what their partners were saying and struggling with. What were some of the things the guys were
Most
saying and struggling with?
most of the guys were pretty happy with what they were doing.
Okay.
What they were struggling with, again, this is like going back a while since I've read
Yeah.
that. I think what they were struggling with, some of them were struggling with like the financial aspect, like not having like expendable money that they're used to having or money that they can spend without checking in with their partners about. Um, a little bit of stigma and shame around it because the connection of work to men's identity is like, it's long standing and
Sure.
it's relevant to a lot of guys even still that like what you do is who you are. And I think that's outdated, but it's still present. So that I think is a challenge a lot of men face. A feeling that they should be at work, but they're not, that somehow work is more valued than doing what's needed. It's coming back to me. One of the quotes that I used in one of the studies that's cited a lot was getting men to think about, this is probably one of the key points of this whole thing is like men are used to thinking about themselves as providers. Like I provide for the family. And that provider mentality is usually connected to money. And
Yeah.
that's what men have historically, been linked to. Um, but a lot of the guys in these studies that we did interviews and quantitative like evaluations with are what enabled them to make that switch in a healthy way is thinking of being a provider as whatever's needed to be done for their family. And it might be money, it might be support, it might be taking care of the kids. And so I think that men who are able to make that shift in whatever way makes sense for them leads to more healthy outcomes. You know,
Yeah.
um, and there were just other things that were reflective of good relationships, good communication and support and understanding and all these factors that led to a successful marriage and relationships regardless of whether it was kind of a traditional or not traditional setup.
No, I like that. I think that's really cool to think about. These guys trying to just expand that definition of what provider means. That
Yep.
it takes a lot of things, right, to provide for a family, and so to try and move that scope that's bigger than work, money, income, but a lot of other things that that I think many women certainly understand, but these guys have really grappled with. And so I think that's really cool to see them do that and struggle with that, but then in the end come out the other side. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's the thing.
Yeah. Well, what I want to do. Aaron, is since we're kind of moving to this time where I want to talk with you about depression, men's depression. I wanted to talk with you about fatherhood. One last thing that I wanted to, which I think we get into this a little bit, but get your reactions on a little bit before we finish up, is just ask you a little bit about, therapy with men. And I know that this has been something you've been interested in. You're involved in it, where you've done quite a bit of work, I believe, in counseling and kind of thinking outside the
Yeah.
box, like
Yeah.
on what that can look like for guys. And so maybe you could just talk about that for a few minutes. What's that kind of looked like, and what has been some of your journey of thinking how to engage men in this thing that often guys may not have a good understanding of, or maybe kind of hesitant for? What's that looked like for you to work with them in that kind of setting?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I can't summarize all of it, but I
Yeah,
think that outside the box work with men is absolutely what I've been trying to do. And some of it's been symbolically outside the box, like, and some of it's been metaphorically outside the box.
sure.
Like I've been one of the things that I've done in my private practice, which is really pretty small. But I do all of my clients, I do all of, let me start that part again. Um, I see all of my clients actually outside of the traditional office setting.
Okay.
So I had an office for a while, and I had an office for a while, but I wasn't using it very much. So I take all my clients for walks. I'm a big believer in walk therapy.
Okay.
Actually, I think my website is something like walktherapyaustin.com. I also have one that says get out to get in. Thought it was kind of catchy.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
I don't know if that one's still active, but um and I think that my mind has always worked best while moving. And I believe that being outside and in nature is good for you, and even light exercise is good for you. Um, and there are obviously some ethical considerations about seeing clients outside the typical office setting. But honestly, I'm not too worried about them. And I kind of face those challenges head on. And I think there's been um, several instances where it's been a really good fit for guys. I don't think it's perfect in all situations, but I've written a little bit about that. I actually should probably do some more writing about my thoughts of why I think it works so well, as well as why it links and directly confronts a lot of the variables that make therapy so hard for men
Yeah.
sitting down. And sometimes they even joke about it. I'm like, well, if I'm not the best therapist, at least they got some exercise and got outside. So that's 2 out of 3.
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
really is kind of it's seeking the benefits of light exercise, um, being outside and doing therapy all at the same time. And it has a couple other small advantages as well. Happy to talk more about that or answer any questions about that.
No,
Turn
I
it
think
over.
that is interesting to think about, Aaron, and think of my own personal experience as a man, and the friends that I have, and how we often connect. Sometimes it's like we sit down and we're eating or something like that and we're talking, but often it's like we're going to do things together. We have an activity that we connect around, and that's how we end up kind of getting down into what's happening in our lives and how we're feeling and the struggles. And it's through some kind of shared activity. And so I think, kind of logically thinking there, like connecting therapy to that, right? So this relationship that also involves some kind of shared activity together, I think that makes sense, right? And the movement makes sense too, right? We're not just kind of sitting, but we can be up, and we can move, and that can be beneficial. And so, yeah, that seems consistent with what lots of guys do to connect.
Yeah. I also think, just to share like a little bit more about that, like I think that men, I kind of joked around at the start of the interview about this, but they struggle, I mean, sitting down and staring into the
Yeah,
eye of either a male or female therapist. It's maybe hard for different reasons, but still hard, you know?
Yeah.
And then when they do have an emotional moment, like it's tough to do that right in front of somebody else who's looking at you.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've done my walk therapy and I kind of notice that's going on. I'm like, listen, seems like a lot of stuff's going on for you. Why don't you just go take a few moments and sit down at that rock and watch that water go by and see what comes up for you. And when you're ready, I'll be over here to come join me. And that's something like it's kind of simple, but I probably wouldn't do that just sitting in a room with someone, and then symbolically, we're walking together, we're looking ahead, we're on the same path. All of those things are very, good metaphors. We know it also, I mean, time is tricky when you're sitting with someone as a therapist or the client. Time kind of gets away from you.
Yeah.
It's hard to manage that as a therapist. And when you're walking on a path, after you do it a couple times, you do know exactly how long you have
Yeah.
left in the
Yeah.
session. I found that to be very helpful, including usually like a turnaround point.
Yeah.
Okay, we're halfway there. Now, what do we want to focus on the halfway back?
Yeah.
So there's all these little things, and people often ask me when they learn about this about like, well, what if it's really like nasty weather? And I'm like, and I have this, I think, on my website that I think it's also a good metaphor, like the weather and walking. Like, obviously, I don't hold my sessions in extreme conditions when anything's dangerous, thunder or storm, like really serious storm, but rarely is that the scenario. So I say it as like, hey, therapy is it's not always sunny and 60 degrees. Sometimes it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah.
it's too warm, sometimes it's too cold. And so dressing for the weather and kind of sticking it out together is one of my themes as well. And I think guys they like that, although they like it when it's sunny and 60. So like it is right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love it. That's I think a great place for us to finish up on, Aaron.
Sure.
Anything else? Is there anything else that you wanted to put in here? And we're kind of at
Not
the end of
really.
our scheduled time, but anything that you really want to get in there?
Not really.
Okay.
I look forward to the interview, but whatever you do is great. And I thought it went pretty well. So
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I thought it went well
good
too.
stuff.
I think you did great. So nice job, Aaron.
All right, take
Okay.
care, bud.
Bye.
We'll be in touch later.